Okay, I'm going to go back briefly and talk about what a mess China was before World War II. Actually, China was a mess really until 1949, and the suffering in China uh, doesn't end in 49. Tens of millions of Chinese die after the communists take over. The kind of suffering that China has endured, mind-boggling. We just can't human beings can't understand it. It's too much. But anyway, I want to kind of set up a context for what had gone on in China before the advent of World War II. So what you had was you had the Qing dynasty, Q-U-I-N-G, sometimes it's called the Manchu dynasty, had taken over China in the 1600s, in the mid 1600s. They had come from Manchuria, which is a northern region that's sandwiched between China, Mongolia, and Siberia. So they come south. They're actually a different tribal group or ethnic group than most Chinese. The Manchu, I'm going to call them the Manchu dynasty. They're actually less than 5% of the overall Chinese population. But they controlled China until 1912. So what you have, the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty, controls China from the 1640s to 1912. Um, I guess the point I want to make is that China was powerful. It really had been the most powerful nation on earth, you could argue, almost for 1,000 years. The 1700s was a golden era. The empire was stable. The borders were secure. There was enough food to feed the large population of China. The Chinese government opened up most of the land for farming, which was really important. You had international trade. China was very much part of the global system of international trade. Um, think about China. China dishware, porcelain. It was hugely popular in Europe, in the United States, in Great Britain. Well, there's a very robust trade between Great Britain, the United States, and other European countries and China for porcelain. What we call China. We still call it China today. Also for Chinese tea, very popular. Chinese silk, very popular. And so China in the 1700s was a very powerful and very, very respected nation. In fact, it got along very well with Japan. It kind of saw Japan as its little brother during this period. But in the 1800s, things really fall apart in China. What happens is Europe becomes very, very technologically and industrially developed at a time when China is falling behind in terms of industrial production, in terms of technology, which militarily China's falling behind. It, for instance, doesn't isn't able to manufacture the same kind of sophisticated weapons as is the West. So, beginning in the 1800s, China starts falling behind, and the period between 1839 and 1949 is called the Century of Humiliation. China becomes extremely weakened, becomes extremely factionalized during this period. As I've said before, many, many nodes of power. The central government doesn't really run the country, it's inefficient. Um, Other countries are going into China, especially Western countries, in search for markets. And China doesn't really have the military or the technology to stop this. So what happens is China suffers from a century of humiliation, where it's forced to give major concessions to great powers such as England, France, Germany, and to a lesser extent the United States. Now, Great Britain is the primary villain in the story. It's not the singular villain, but it's the primary villain. Great Britain was the most powerful nation on earth. It had the most powerful navy on earth. And it really ran the show in the 1800s. And the primary motive of British imperialism in China was economic. there was very, very high demand for Chinese tea, Chinese silk and porcelain, as I talked about, in the British market. But the British did not have enough silver. They did not have enough hard currency, silver and gold, to create a trade balance with China during this period. So what happened is there was a system of barter that grew up that was based on opium, believe it or not. It was based on opium that was created to bridge the problem of payment. This is how the Brits paid for all the goods that they were taking out of China. Instead of paying in silver, they're paying in opium. And of course, you know, opium is a very addictive substance. And so basically, what the British do is, and to a lesser extent, other nations as well, they get millions of Chinese addicted to opium in order to create a balance of trade with China. Um, so you had an exponential growth in the opium use of opium by Chinese between the early 1800s and the late 1830s. Much of this opium came from India, and as you can guess, that this addiction, this incredible increase in addiction, created a generation of addicts and also tremendous social instability. I think this is an analogy that's not unfair. It's almost if a foreign government in 2019 was introducing opioids into the United States in order to buy U.S. goods. And what makes it even worse, I mean, it's a very, very shocking story, right? And don't you think for a second the Chinese have forgotten about this. The West has forgotten about it. Well, you know, you've probably heard of the Opium Wars, but believe me, the Chinese remember this, okay? And they're not happy about it, as you can imagine. And so what happens is the Chinese government tries to put a halt to this importation of opium into its borders. In the early mid 1830s, the court prohibits the imports of opium and attempts to close the ports such as Canton, which is now Guangzhou, which is, by the way, my daughter was born in Guangzhou, in southern China. It was called Canton, now it's called Guangzhou, and Shanghai, and attempted to close these ports to the opium trade. Uh, in the late 1830s, the Chinese government actually burned over 1 million kilograms of confiscated opium. And then what you had was is that the Chinese government started clashing with British merchants. And this developed into a war between China and Great Britain. And in this war, Great Britain was had its allies. France was an ally, Russia was an ally, the United States was an ally, and China loses this war. China loses the first Opium War. There's a second Opium War. I can't talk about it. The first one is really the significant one because in losing the war to Great Britain, first of all, China has to accept this forced importation by a foreign power of this addictive substance into China. Just as importantly, China loses a significant amount of its sovereignty. And what do I mean by sovereignty? I mean China lost a significant amount of its ability to control its own affairs. In the early 1840s, as a result of the Opium Wars, Hong Kong, which had been just a very, very lightly populated island off the coast of southern China, it becomes a protectorate of Great Britain. So Hong Kong, as a result of the Opium Wars, Hong Kong it becomes goes into British hands, and this is one of the things you need to think about when you're thinking about what's going on in Hong Kong today. Hong Kong has this very idiosyncratic history in the history of China because until 1997 it was run by the British. And so actually Hong Kong does have an experience of pluralism. I don't want to apologize for British imperialism, But Hong Kong has just had a kind of a different experience than the rest of China. And we're seeing this tension now between Hong Kong and the rest of China. And that tension is based on the fact that Hong Kong had been handed over to the British because of the Chinese loss in the Opium War of 1842. Um, so the other thing is that British merchants gained the right to trade in 5 treaty ports in China. In 1843, a treaty was signed at gunpoint where British citizens in China, if they committed a crime, they were tried in a British court, not in a Chinese court, which of course gave them, they'd be basically they could almost do anything they wanted in China because they were not going to be punished by the Chinese authorities. So again, what you have is China is losing a large ability to run its own affairs. In Shanghai, in China, you have these 2 areas that are the foreign enclaves, which basically ran their own affairs. The Chinese government does run its own affairs. So during this period, China is losing significant amounts of its sovereignty, and at the same time, these foreign powers are forcing China to accept this addictive substance. Um, Very briefly, in the 1850s and early 1860s, the largest civil war in U.S. history, see, there's a mistake. The largest civil war in global history occurs, the Taiping Rebellion, which was an attack on the Manchu dynasty. Um, again, these figures 20 to 30 million people. You know what's crazy when I say 20 to 30 million people? That's like 10 million people that we don't know about. I mean, 10 million people is a lot of people. But we're just talking about mass death, mass suffering. 600 cities were wiped off the map. Ultimately, the Manchu dynasty prevails in the Taiping Rebellion. And fun fact, Mao Zedong, the communist leader, he really admired the folks that started the Taipei Rebellion, the ones that were ultimately defeated by the Manchu government. And if you go to Tiananmen Square in central Beijing, there's a prominent place in Tiananmen Square to the instigators of the Taiping Rebellion. Another thing, here's how crazy it was in China during this period. The individual that started the Taiping Rebellion, he said that he was the brother of Jesus Christ, which isn't that incredible? He had been deeply influenced by Christian missionaries. This is something else that the Chinese really resented. The West forced China to accept Christian missionaries, which undermined, they felt, the traditional Chinese religious of Confucianism. And so this person had encountered a missionary, but isn't that wild? The guy that started the bloodiest civil war in global history is claiming that he was a brother of Jesus Christ because he had had a relationship with a Western, actually a guy from Tennessee. So it's not good in China in the 1800s. I think that's fair to say.